Tommy, no pronouns given, calling in all the way from Portugal, my goodness, who wants to talk about the problem of suffering. Tommy, you are on the Atheist Experience with Forrest and Jim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. And thank you for choosing me.
Yeah. So what did you want to talk about us? About with us? Those are words. Those are all the words I was trying to say.
So I do believe that the problem of suffering, and in general the problem of evil, is the greatest challenge to the Christian faith. I think it's very hard to try to come up with any sort of answer, and I often find that the answers many Christians come up with are just not worthy of any respect, either morally or rationally. I do respect, to a great extent, people who reject God based on suffering. I think that's respectable. I understand them. But I would like to try to give them a different view, a Christian view on the problem of suffering that I find is underrepresented.
Okay. So just to be clear, the problem of suffering and the problem of evil really is what it is, because it's not suffering. Suffering is just something that happens, but it really is the problem of evil, right? And that is that if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. If God is omnipotent, then he has the power to eliminate all evil. If God is omniscient, then God knows when evil exists. If God is morally perfect, then God has a desire to eliminate all evil. Evil exists. If evil exists and God exists, then either God doesn't have the power to eliminate all evil, or doesn't know when evil exists, or doesn't have the desire to eliminate all evil. Therefore, God does not exist. That's the formal argument, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that understanding of the problem of evil relies on assumptions about God, the world, and the relation of God to the world that I would say not only are not the best, but are not representative of classical Christian belief. That we can take it from a specific angle if you'd like to attack it, or do you want me to?
You're the one driving this. I agree with the problem of evil. It means that the Christian God, as the triomni God, right, the omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God, can't logically exist. So if you're going to make an argument, then you need to prove that evil can exist with that triomni God.
Yeah, basically the only time I've ever, I've talked to a lot of Christians who struggle with this, and the only arguments I've ever heard against it, and I know you said that a lot of the arguments are bad, so like you probably agree, but the only arguments I've ever heard against it thus far are either that the triomni situation isn't what we think it is, that one of those omnis isn't real, or that evil is actually a necessary and good part of the grand divine plan. And so God is allowing this evil on purpose. Or the third one is the cop out of saying, well, it's all about free will. And like you have the free will to do evil and God can't stop you from having that free will, which also goes against the Bible and the concept of God in the first place, but that's neither here nor there. Those are the three ones that I get all the time, is either one of the omnis is not right, or evil is actually good, or God must allow evil and still can have the triomni situation, which kind of goes into the second one as well. Right. If you're offering us one of those, I will be apocalyptically grumpy with you. But if you're offering us something different, I'm into it.
Yeah, well, my biggest problem with the second one you mentioned, that's the one that I find most abhorrent. The idea that evil is necessary and good.
Right. So because the end justifies the means, right?
My response, yeah, I have many problems with that. So my response is, it will either be the first and the third, or it will at least sound like them. So the understanding of God in the classical Christian tradition that I adhere to, like the basic definition of God, it doesn't start at the triomni properties. There's something that you conclude from the idea of God being limitless and infinite. And so he's limitless and infinite in every way. And you need to start from that and to understand the omni-properties within that context. So when we say that God is all-powerful, it's because he's unlimited, and so nothing can limit his nature from expressing itself fully.
Right.
And because God's nature is good and goodness, the idea of God doing something evil or bad would itself be a limitation of his nature. The only way for God to do something evil would be for something to limit God's nature from expressing itself.
Well, so it's the problem of evil is not that God is doing evil. So the problem of evil is not God doing evil. The problem of evil is that God allows evil to exist.
Which you could argue is doing evil. Like if I don't stop somebody from being murdered, you could argue that I'm culpable, you know?
Well, only if you're I would say only if you're omnibenevolent, right? If you're a human being, your ability to interfere without risk to yourself means you're by definition not omnibenevolent.
That's a good point. Yeah, omnibenevolent and omnipotent go along with that. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. So like, yeah, it's kind of my issue, Tommy. From what you just said, I don't understand the difference between your statement about God's, the omnipotent power, the unlimited power. I don't understand the fundamental difference between that and any other way that we could say that. To say, if I just say to you, there's nothing God can't do, God is all powerful, God can do whatever he wants, and you say God has no limits, nothing can stop God from expressing his nature, which is to be good. I don't understand the fundamental difference between these two concepts and why you're drawing a distinction.
Yeah, because this understanding of God's nature is what connects to the third response you mentioned, of the idea that to God, evil exists because of our choices. And for God to remove our choices would be for God to do something bad, because choices, meaningful choices about morality, are important.
So just to be clear, then,
not being able to remove
what you're saying
is not a limitation on his power.
So just to be clear, God sees somebody doing something evil, murder, rape, genocide, whatever it may be, no matter how bad, no matter how extreme it is, God sees this and makes a moral judgment that either God can stop this evil taking place or can allow it and preserve this person's autonomy. And God values the autonomy of the murderer, rapist, genocidal, whatever, that person's autonomy to do whatever they want is more of a moral high ground for God than interfering and stopping this evil thing from happening to innocent people.
I think that seems to be the only coherent response to the problem of evil.
So let me propose this to you. Let me propose this to you. A parent sees their child getting ready to hit another child. Should they allow that, or is it moral to allow that, or is it more moral to put a stop to that?
I would say we should put a stop to that.
How is that any different than God wanting to put a stop to people doing evil?
Because the idea is that if God does not allow any evil, that would essentially turn us into just robots doing whatever.
If the parent doesn't allow the child, then just substitute God for a parent allowing the child to hit another child. Just make that substitution for me and tell me how that works. Because the actions are the same, right? I could say God knows that one child is about to hit another child, and you're saying it's okay for God to not interfere, but it's not okay for a parent to not interfere. What's the difference here? All we're doing is substituting the subject, God, for parent, right? That's all we're doing. It's the same situation, and you have two different moral choices. You're claiming one's good, one's bad. I don't see any difference. So what's the difference?
Yeah, great question. I understand it's hard to respond. I would say that, when we stop a child from hitting another child, we are not removing the limits. We're not removing the ability for the child like deliberate.
God doesn't have to. God's in the exact same situation. He doesn't have to limit the child's ability to make a choice at all. God is in the exact. In fact, God is as an omnipotent being. God is in a better position to stop one child from hitting another child without interfering with that child's free will than the parent is, right? And you're making this assumption. This is an assumption that everybody who comes into this argument makes, is that the only way for God to prevent something from happening is to take away somebody's free will. It's really, he has many more options. For instance, he could simply move the two apart, right? A parent would over and grab the swinging fist and stop the fist and lecture the child. God could do the same thing, right? So anything that a limited power person, individual can do, entity can do, God can do better because he's not limited. So once again, you're limiting God's ability to interfering with free will. So you're putting a limit on your God. And you're putting a limit on your God that the parent doesn't have, right?
I think an important distinction is the idea of understanding creation, like all of creation, as one whole. That
has nothing to do with. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
It doesn't.
It does.
You're going off on a tangent. Because what we're talking about,
the parent and the child are part of the same thing. They're part of creation. God is apart from creation. Right. The whole point of creation is for it.
So this. I'm sorry. I Tommy. What's frustrating to me is that what's frustrating to me, Tommy, is that you're trying to put God as this special thing where like morality doesn't seem to apply to him in the same way, and yet he is the final arbiter of morality. Well, by saying that he's different from creation, so like all the evil and suffering that happens in this world is different, has different rules and different implications because he's separate from creation. Like, how is that not what you're saying?
Because the suffering isn't doesn't come from God. It comes from creation.
Not suffering. It's evil. We're not talking about suffering. We're talking about evil.
It also, like, I'm sorry, but it ultimately does. It come from God. Ultimately, it does.
Right, because I think what you're missing is that what I'm saying is that God and the parent are both moral actors. So I don't care who the moral actor is. If you claim that a moral actor is acting morally when they stop a child from hitting another child, then substituting in an actual person or entity, God or a person, doesn't matter, you're now changing, and you come up with two different answers to the same scenario depending on who the moral actor is, then morals are subjective. There's no objectivity to it, right? Objective, 2 + 2 is always 4. So I don't see how you're getting around this very, very simple fact that if a moral actor performs an action that we claim is moral, it doesn't matter who we substitute in for the moral actor, whether it's God, a human being, or an orangutan. It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. The difference in the point I was trying to communicate is that the whole purpose of creation is for creation to learn to recognize and to choose the goodness of God by itself. So when you say the wholeness of creation, do you mean that that rocks are supposed to? Because rocks are a part of creation. Or are you just talking about moral actors like humans? I'm an idealist. I believe that the world is fundamentally of consciousness and matter is a derivative. So all things are a product of consciousness that will ultimately align with God.
So rocks have consciousness? Do we want to go off on that tangent? I don't think we do.
We don't. I promise the whole other thing. I have a totally different line of questions, Jim, if you're okay with it, unless you're in the middle of something. I don't want to derail you.
Go ahead.
So quickly,
I mean,
Tommy,
he still hasn't addressed. Yeah.
No, he hasn't, and I'm hoping to attach it from the other direction just for a second here. Tommy, is the Bible true and accurate and like a fair depiction of God?
It depends on how it's interpreted. I think we need to be careful, especially the Old Testament.
Is a plain text reading of the Bible an appropriate way to understand God?
No.
Okay, so then you would disagree, I'm sure, where in Exodus it repeatedly says that Pharaoh wanted to let the Israelites go, but God hardened his heart so that he would not let them go, which would be a direct violation of the Pharaoh's free will. I'm assuming you don't think that that is an accurate interpretation of that part of the Bible.
Yeah.
Okay, so then let's try a different character. That's why I asked, all right? Let's try a different character. What about the character of Satan? Is Satan real, do you believe?
Yeah, I remember this question from a previous. So we have to clarify, if when we talk about Satan, we're talking about something like the spirit of sin, or we're talking about evil embodied?
I'm talking about maybe you have a different understanding of me. I'm talking about the common Christian understanding of the word Satan being another name for the fallen angel, Lucifer, the devil, the person who was at the beginning, who knew God, was created by God, met God personally, rebelled against God, and is now in charge of hell. That guy.
Sure. I mean, I have some issues with that characterization, but let's grant it for now because they're not relevant.
Okay. Sure. So my question then, and maybe you have a way like to tell me why I'm misinterpreting this, is that like the big thing that Jim and I seem to be hung up on here is that God could interfere. God could show up and tell people, hey, quit murdering each other. It's not fun. It's not a cool thing to do. God could physically intervene. God could intervene just like as a parent scolding us. God could come in and say something. There's a million ways that God could handle the situation of evil in the world without violating free will. And you seem to think that there's an issue there. My question to you is, does Lucifer have free will? The dude knew God personally, knows beyond anybody's like understanding who and what God is. Satan understands God better than you ever could hope to, and knows God's rules and knows God's personality and knows the punishments and the judgments and everything, and still makes the free choice to rebel and to turn against him. Why would God not afford us the same liberty as he affords Satan to come down here and say, listen, y'all, genocide's bad, quit doing it, and we can choose whether or not we want to align ourselves with this God that we now know for sure exists?
I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of Satan. I think it's impossible for any rational spirit to fully know God and to go against God. Whenever anyone, human or otherwise, goes against God, it's either because of some ignorance or because they're enslaved to some vice or something like that. And the same.
So you think
whose fault is the ignorance?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I was going to say you're saying that Satan does not know God then.
Not fully, or at least he's not.
Whose fault is that?
Cool. So then there's your issue that I also have, and that's exactly what Jim's asking, is like, who's at involved? If Satan, the dude who met God in person and was there at the beginning, who witnessed, this whole thing, who was the birth of the creation and all this, Satan is the best possible chance that we can have, along with the other angels, I suppose, to be as close as possible to God, and still doesn't understand enough to make the right choices. What fucking hope do we have, Tommy? How is it fair for God to judge us when we know him so much worse than Satan, and Satan still can't make the right choice?
I don't think we know him much less than Satan. I think Satan was in a similar position when he went against God.
Whose fault is our ignorance?
Ignorance is a result of privation that comes from creation ex nihilo.
So whose fault is the ignorance, though? God's, right? God has chosen to have us remain ignorant. Because God is omnipotent, which means he has the power, and he's omniscient, so he knows we're ignorant. Mm-hmm. And he knows that our ignorance is going to force us to make bad choices, or to allow us to make bad choices.
I think it forces us.
And he's omnipotent, so he has the power to educate us. Or we're still coming back to the same thing, right? We still come back to the same problem. God is omnipotent, therefore he has the power to educate us in such a way that we would never want to choose evil. And without taking away any choice from us at all, God has that power, because God is also omniscient, which means he knows our hearts and our minds. And so he can make this. And it doesn't matter our intelligence level. It doesn't matter anything other than God has the power. So it's God's fault we're ignorant.
Yes.
So again, we come back to that if we're ignorant because of God, then God is either not omnipotent, not omniscient, or not omnibenevolent, right? We're right back to the same three knots that you claim are true. No matter how you slice this cake, it keeps coming up. God, the triomni God cannot exist. It's logically impossible. With the world as it is today, with the universe as it is as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
Can I respond?
Sure.
Yeah.
The process you described of God helping us know the truth and not be ignorant, that is what the process of creation is that we are going through right now. But that learning can't be imposed.
But it's not benevolent. But it's not benevolent. Right? Because right now there are people dead before Christ was born who never had the chance to learn that.
Mm-hmm.
Can you repeat that?
There are people dead before Christ was born who've never had a chance to learn this. There are people dying all over the world who don't know any of this, right? There are Buddhists and there are Islamic folks and there are Jainists and, all these people all around the world who are dying without knowing anything because God has chosen to not do the benevolent thing, or he doesn't know this is happening, or he doesn't have the power to change it.
It's not impossible for those people to do good.
I'm not saying it's
right,
impossible.
But it is impossible. But it is impossible for them to go to heaven because they have not confessed with their mouths that Jesus is Lord, or whatever the weird scripture is. So because these people live in ignorance and die in ignorance of God, they will not go to heaven. So
I'm a universalist. I believe everyone will ultimately be saved. Everyone will come to recognize the truth.
So then there's no point in doing good. If we're all going to be saved, there's no point in doing good? Did you just say that?
Doing good.
Well, that's the effect of what you just said.
Has intrinsic value. So first, two things. Good has intrinsic value. And if you live your life doing very bad things and only later have a change of heart and choose the good, that will be very painful for you to recognize all the evil stuff you've done.
Okay.
But that's still not benevolent.
Because it's intrinsic.
Right?
Valuable.
Allowing people to choose evil, knowing they're going to feel bad later, that is not benevolent.
No.
The alternative is not giving them choice.
No, it's not. Now you're saying your God's not omnipotent.
Right. That's it. We've been trying to make it very clear this entire time that there are plenty of options God has available to him that could help us to understand him, to understand good, to do all these things, and would not result in the violation of our free will, and wouldn't doom us to an eternity of damnation or of whatever heaven is or anything like that. It's just at the end of the day, I can't get past this concept that the free will of the rapist is more important than the protection of the victim, because eventually the rapist will feel bad someday, and that's morality. And it's not good enough for me. This God is not good enough for me. So, Tommy, it's been 23 minutes and we've got several other calls. I think it's about time we move on, but I encourage you to call us back sometime if you want to talk about this more. So far, you have not changed my mind, at least, that this God is any less monstrous than I thought it was, if indeed it is real at all. But I do appreciate your time. You've been a very pleasant person to talk to.